Okay. So what I want to talk about is I think one of the most important uh, um, studies that W.E.B. Du Bois conducted in the early 20th century. So for those of you who don't know, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, his dates are 1868 to 1963. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He died August 27, 1963, at the age of 95 in Accra, Ghana, where he had departed to after being here in the United States. He was educated at Fisk University, historically Black college in Nashville, Tennessee, also Harvard, and then he also studied at the University of Berlin. He's the author of 22 works of history, sociology, and literature. He was an editor of the Crisis magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, of which he was a founding member. He was leader of the Pan-Africanist movement and long-term activist. I mean, admit for many people, he is the most towering African-American intellectual of the 20th century. The Atlanta University studies. So in 1897, Du Bois inaugurated a series of sociological studies of African Americans at Atlanta University. These studies were designed to provide, in his words, objective, scientific, sociological data on the conditions of African Americans in the United States. There were 18 volumes. They covered a range of topics, including in 1896, mortality, 1897, study of homes, study of reform, two studies of economic organizations, two studies of education, study of religion, crime, and then he also published an extensive bibliography and treatise on his methodologies. So the one that we're going to talk about today is The Health and Physique of the Negro American, 1906. It is a report of a social study made under the direction of Atlanta University, together with the proceedings of the 11th Conference for the Study of Negro Problems that was held at Atlanta University on May 29th, 1906. So the production of these studies, like The Health and Physique of the Negro American, were always held in conjunction with these conferences on the study of Negro problems. And they are one of the earliest and some of the most significant social studies of African Americans, of course, known as Negroes at the time, that were being conducted by anyone in the United States. So why is this study important? So this was, quote, the first significant scientific approach to the health problems and biological study of the Negro, unquote. And this is a comment by William Montague Cobb, who is an MD and PhD. Montague Cobb has a really important place in the history of medicine, particularly for African Americans. He was a president of the National Medical Association, and his PhD is in physical anthropology. He's the first African American to earn a PhD in physical anthropology from this country. And so he's uniquely qualified to make some comments about the impact of this study. And he did so in a preface to a republication of the original 1906 study. And this is also an important study because it's an example of an attempt by an African-American intellectual to use science to challenge scientific racism. In this study, Du Bois was addressing some of the most intractable questions in the discourse about race in the United States at the time. He used data from census reports, life insurance companies, vital records of various towns, reports from the US Surgeon General reports from Negro hospitals and drugstores, Negro medical schools and physicians, measurements of 1,000 Hampton University students, and he also looked at this general literature. So Hampton University is a historically Black college in Hampton, Virginia. And you'll see that DuBois is really engaged in gathering this data, and why so much data is really the question, because his goal, as he said, was to produce a quote, an increasing body of scientifically ascertained fact instead of the vague mass of the so-called Negro problems, unquote. And through these studies, DuBois went after the prejudice generalizations made by whites, who sometimes, he wrote, quote, based their facts about the Negro on evidence as flimsy as observations made through looking out of train windows while traveling through the South. He also wanted to challenge the view that of all the races, the Negro race, by reason of its pronounced physical characteristics, was easiest to distinguish, that is, to distinguish among other races. And he noted the human species so shade and mingle with each other that not only was it impossible to draw a color line between Blacks and other races, but in all physical characteristics, the Negro race cannot be set off by itself as absolutely different. And I think you can hear the echoes in these two comments of where he was trying the kinds of, I should say, the kinds of general comments, views of African Americans that were so persistent at this time. And he was taking up those questions directly. But I think one thing I wanted to just step back for a second is to talk about how race was understood in 1900. And I depend on and relied upon the discussion that the historian of anthropology, George Stocking Jr. had noted, that by 1900, there was no generally accepted answer to the question, what is race? DuBois writes with great authority in the ways in which he, and in doing so, he indicates that he really understands what race is, but and what many people around him understand. But Stocking emphasizes that there was no generally accepted answer to the question, what is race, among many intellectuals and other observers. The term, Stocking argues, was a catch-all applied to various human groups, nations, continental regions, language groups, perceived body traits, or peoples whose similar appearance, manner, and speech persisted over time and therefore self-evidently viewed as hereditary. And I think it's really important to recognize that at this time, there's no separation between these kinds of concepts or characteristics that fell into this kind of overarching generalization, generalizing term of what constituted race. And the other interesting, I think, thing we should hold on to at the moment that the publication of the Health and Physique of the Negro American occurred is also what John Haller, historian of medicine, argued as late as 1980, that historians had argued that physicians were the single most important group involved in biologizing racial categories. Physicians' comparisons of disease differences between whites and African Americans, and of course, again, I'll slip back and forth using the term African Americans and Negroes, they simply assumed that there were innate biological, mental, and physiological causes underlying any such differences that they observed. And it was widely assumed that the cause of such differences was racial, and no further explanation or exploration was actually needed. Differences in mortality and morbidity for diverse diseases was simply seen as manifestations of different racial capacities. And that is the kind of study that you would often see, this intense comparison of actual cases of disease and of bodily characteristics that happen over and over again, comparing whites and Blacks, and of course, producing the very idea of what was white and what was Black at the same time. And then, of course, anthropology, in a way, followed medicine, and topically, as Haller went on to say, Anthropology was noted as following the field of medicine in turning its attention to the Negro. But while anthropologists with stronger ties to medicine focused on linking disease and racial biology, those involved in placing more professional distance between anthropology and medicine did not necessarily follow suit. And studies conducted by the latter group examined the comparative skeletal morphology of whites and Negroes. And this is a comment by Hollow, which is indicating that a lot of the sort of earlier anatomical studies of comparisons between whites and Blacks that were pretty commonplace in American medicine were being reviewed by 1900 by those studying in anthropology, and they began to do, to some extent, take those anatomical studies and move them to into a different direction, but still employing a kind of comparative method to examine skeletal morphology of whites and Negroes. So one of the leading American physical anthropologists, I should say he wasn't American, but a US-based physical anthropologist, Alice Hrdlicka, was one of the people who said that many of the medical studies were flawed and were confusing and weren't done very well, and that he wanted to place American physical anthropology on a better, more scientific, more quantitatively oriented study of skeletal morphology to really come to the truth of the differences between whites and Negroes. So it's safe to say that by 1900, biologists, anthropologists, and physicians viewed race as an integrated physical, linguistic, and cultural totality. And this is the race that is the focus of DuBois's analysis and his critiques. So the health and physique of the Negro American begins with a set of photographs depicting different types of African Americans. So here's a slide that depicts full-blooded Negro types. And this is a category that DuBois employed, and certainly Hrdlicka and other physical anthropologists took up those categories as well going forward. And as you can see, there are these sort of portrait-like photos of these full-blooded Negro types, all of pretty much darker skin. He also showed slides of mulatto types that would be mixed, people of mixed race, sort of different in color, even though these are black and white. You can see they're lighter skin, perhaps have a different hair. He also had a category called white types with Negro blood, and these would be people who were probably first generation, having a parent, one or other parent who was white and one parent who was maybe African American. And DuBois wanted these photographs to be taken as evidence to prove the lie that African Americans were inherently different from whites by pointing out the fact that all great peoples of the world, he said, are the result of a mixture of races. So he's actually trying to point to the heterogeneity of physical types within the African American community, which, as far as I could tell, very few people were commenting upon. I often have seen the sort of late 19th century studies of comparisons between African Americans and whites, where white physicians are beginning to disaggregate these the people that they observe into categories similar to the ones that DuBois deploys, but not in any sort of systematic way. And so DuBois really wanted to just emphasize that there was indeed heterogeneity, and that what had happened by 1900, based on the fact of the slave trade and mixing between the races, that the African American community was not one physical type, as many had assumed it would have been directly at the earlier points in under slavery. And so he wanted to emphasize the mixed aspect of the population. The photographs were accompanied by text describing each person's lineage. For example, one description was very dark brown in color, crisp, tightly curled hair, short and stocky in build, strong, honest, and reliable. Of course, speaking to the definition he's working with, that is a mixture, the race is a mixture, right, of physical characteristics, as well as behavioral characteristics, as well as moral characteristics. Or some he would describe as being light yellow, that skin type, wavy hair, rather small in stature, good mind and character, and quiet. He concluded that some of the children that he had taken photographs of had come from comfortable, well-to-do homes, while some are practically street waifs, he says. Some were educated, a few had college-bred parents, others had parents who could neither read nor write, and so on. And he said, under such circumstances, how rash it is to hazard wild statements as to the ability of millions of people without waiting for exact study and careful measurements. Again, emphasizing the heterogeneity of the Black community in terms of not just physical type, but also class and education and occupation. And he felt that those were important factors to be considered if one was going to study the quote unquote Negro problems in any kind of accurate and close to scientific way. So he turns to, after a discussion of theories of race in the text, which I won't go into today, he turned to issues of health and mortality, and he included data on skin color, hair type, morality. One category was the Negro as a patient, migration, effects of freedom on the physical and psychological development of the Negro. Now, this point is a direct rebuttal to the work of Frederick Hoffman, the German-born statistician for the Prudential Life Insurance Company, who wrote Race, Trace, and Tendencies of the Negro, which was a very important report that suggested that African Americans were going to be dying out because of their particular physical and moral failures and frailties. And so he and also Hoffman took up the fact that many observers, white observers anyway, believed that freedom had actually had a direct physical impact on the African Americans, the formerly enslaved, and that it in some ways changed both their physical constitutions as well as their psychological characteristics. DuBois also included data on body parts, the femur, the foot, eye, the prostrate, the prostate, sorry, spine, muscle anomalies, ear structure, skull, brain, skeleton, pelvis, and ovaries. He also examined disease processes, fibroid processes, trachoma, general disease peculiarities, which was sort of a catch-all term, and tuberculosis, anemia, typhoid, and syphilis. And the charts look very much like this slide here. He has, the list is typhoid fever, measles, malaria, syphilis, alcoholism, dysentery, gonorrhea, insanity, frostbite, smallpox, sunstroke, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. And then he has the chart goes from white, a chart for whites and a chart for color. There is a little bit of ambiguity in the ways he used color because of course he had this disaggregation of the Black community, right, in terms of darker skin, mixed bloods, and then those closer to being of white. And then he uses colored as a kind of catch-all term that doesn't quite capture his categorization earlier. But here he notes that the rates of mortality rates for whites in his color category are not always that the Black people have higher mortality rates than whites. So for example, the mortality rate for measles is lower, the mortality rates for malaria lower, those for syphilis lower, alcoholism and gonorrhea. These are all kind of interesting. And he goes on to talk a bit more about those specific diseases. So what's he trying to prove? DuBois wants to refute the view that high rates of disease in African-American populations post-slavery indicated that the Black race was rapidly dying out, proving that they were inherently inferior to whites, which is the Hoffman thesis. He analyzes mortality rates by city and by region, comparing white and Black rates in each. He also considers climate, the density of the population, and specific diseases, and their material effect on each of these on mortality rates. And he found that consumption and pneumonia, infantile diarrhea, and heart disease were among the leading causes of deaths among African Americans. And of these, tuberculosis and consumption overall was also the leading cause of death for whites, as many of you know. He also asked the question, are the differences racial? And he argued that the differences that he observed could be explained by other factors. The high death rate of Northern Blacks was lower than both Blacks and whites in Southern cities. The death rate among whites of the stockyard districts in Chicago were higher than the Blacks of the city, and high infant mortality rates have been controlled in whites by access to better water, sanitation, and infant care. So he's constantly showing the ways in which to take the Black population and not disaggregate it, to not look at what happens to other groups of whites who also live in whatever area you're studying and maybe have similar social conditions or environmental conditions, we might say today, and then say, you know, are we looking at something that is about race, or are we looking at something about these conditions? He was very interested in making it clear that the rates of mortality for Southern whites were very high, and that Northern Blacks had much, in several cases that he looked at, had lower mortality rates. And so therefore, that sort of general conclusion that people like Hoffman would make, that all Blacks were suffering such high mortality rates over those of whites that the Black population would soon die out, could not be sustained if one looked at the data in this kind of specific and local way, instead of this broad swath of data that actually had not been particularly well verified. He argued that consumption/tuberculosis was not a racial disease, but a social disease, a direct index of exploitative labor practices, poor housing conditions and sanitation, and lack of access to medical care. But he argued that as of yet, at the time he was writing, no careful study of consumption had been done, and it has been made in order to see whether or not the race factor can be eliminated, and if not, what part it plays. And he's basically saying if race matters, then somebody has to explain how it matters and show how and why it matters. And his argument was that that work simply had not been done. The undeniable fact, he noted, is that in certain diseases, the Negroes have a much higher rate than the whites, and especially in consumption, pneumonia, and infantile diseases. But the question is, again, is this racial? Mr. Hoffman would lead us to say yes, and to infer that it means that Negroes are inherently inferior in physiques to whites. So much of this discussion is really about countering the beliefs and the statements made by Frederick Hoffman, as I said earlier. And he went on to say that the difference in Philadelphia, for example, in his other major study, the Philadelphia Negro, indeed, it actually explains a lot of the same material that he has presented in Health and Physique of the Negro American. He noted that the difference in Philadelphia could be explained on other grounds than upon race. If the population were divided as to social and economic conditions, the matter of race would be eliminated. We might continue this argument almost indefinitely, going to one conclusion, that the Negro death rate and sickness are largely matters of conditions and not due to racial traits and tendencies. So he makes a few recommendations in the report. The present death rate is still, however, far too high. And the members of that he had gathered together in this conference recommended the formation of local health leagues among colored people for the dissemination of better knowledge of sanitation and preventative medicine. He argued that the general organizations throughout the country for bettering health ought to make special effort to reach the colored people because the health of the whole country depends in no little degree upon the health of Negroes. The conference attendees, I should say, the conference attendees did not find any adequate scientific warrant for the assumption that the Negro race was inferior to other races in physical build or vitality. The present differences in mortality, he argued, seem to be sufficiently explained by conditions of life, and physical measurements proved that the Negro was a normal human being capable of average human accomplishments. And one of his other conclusions was that really goes back to his original goal for even starting the Atlanta University studies, which was that he argued that Negro problems are problems of human beings. They cannot be explained away by fantastic theories, ungrounded assumptions, or metaphysical subtleties. And he also took the time at one point to try to explain why it was so important to him to do these kinds of studies. And he was really interrogating and responding to some of the statements that had been made by other observers that DuBois wasn't sufficiently objective to conduct such a study. And by that, I mean other white social scientists. And they believed that because he was a Negro and he's writing about Negroes and studying Negroes, he could not be objective about the people who he's in fact studying. And he replied to this by saying, "I do not for a moment doubt that my Negro descent and narrow group culture have in many cases predisposed me to interpret my facts too favorably for my race. But there is little danger of long misleading here, for champions of white folks are legion. The Negro has long been the clown of history, the football of anthropology, and the slave of industry. I am trying to show here why these attitudes can no longer be maintained. And I realize that the truth of history lies not in the mouths of partisans, but rather in the calm of science that sits between. Her cause I seek to serve, and wherever I fail, I am at least paying truth the respect of earnest effort." So this is DuBois's rebuttal to people who suggested that he was not sufficiently subjective. His position, though, was not taken up by many other observers. And you might know that when the Carnegie Foundation decided to support a large study of African Americans and of race in the United States, the American Dilemma, they considered many of the questions that DuBois is taking up, in particular in this study. And they decided that they had to go outside of the United States to get someone to be the leader of the project that led to the American Dilemma. In fact, because though they thought DuBois had good questions, they did not think that he was sufficiently objective to lead such a study. And the American Dilemma was then, of course, led by the economist Gunnar Myrdal. Though many of the people who worked with DuBois on the Atlanta University study were in fact hired by Myrdal to work on the American Dilemma. Reactions to the study, in some respects, when it first came out, this is the only one I've been able to find, and this is written again by W. Montague Cobb, and he says, neither the Negro medical profession nor the Negro educational world was ready for it. Its potential usefulness was not realized by Negroes. Whites were hostile to such a study, which embraced the anthropology, psychology, and physical health of the Negro. This study was an extraordinary forward pass, heaved the length of the field, but there were no receivers. And so let me stop there to take some questions since we don't have much more time. And so there's been at this point a kind of reassessment of DuBois's work. There was a nice excerpt from Health and Physique of the Negro American, which appeared in the American Journal of Public Health in the section on public health then and now a few years ago. Many people began to turn to look at both the kinds of data that DuBois collected, as well as looking at what he's done in a recent book that's come out on the ways in which he's presented the data. His data visualization techniques are extraordinary, and that's part of what I'd be working on now. And in those visualizations, one of the things that you could see is the ways in which he tried to put the collection of data in particular contexts. So he's showing mortality rates, for example, for some specific disease, and he'll show that in the context of how many lynchings occurred in particular areas at the same time. Other kinds of changes in Jim Crow law, for example. And he's emphasizing that these are the other kinds of factors, along with specific social conditions having to do with housing or access to good sanitation and other things like that, that also shape and had some impact on mortality and morbidity among African-American communities across the United States. Those visualizations are extraordinary, and many people have not, as we begin to look at them, have not realized that he was also engaged in trying to figure out really significant ways to emphasize what his data was reporting. He also wanted to do this because he presented at the World Exposition in Paris, and he had a small booth where he was going to show all this information about the Negro to the people coming to the World Exposition. And he had to do it quickly and in ways that people could easily pick up his main points. And I think that was one of the impetus for him doing these visualization slides. So that's what I wanted to say about DuBois's study. For me, certainly, as I've read so much of studies of African Americans' health throughout the 19th century, this really is the first and absolutely most sophisticated attempt to break through the kinds of attitudes, generalizations, biased views that you see so much of in the public health and medical literature. And DuBois is asking for a return, for a first emphasis on real objective scientific studies that look very much and very familiar to us in the kind of work that we try to do today. Certainly, his questions remain incredibly salient. So thank you.